I used to think identity was something you either had or didn't have, like a name on a form, like the shape of your face in a school photo. You grow into it the way you grow into a jacket, and then you stop thinking about it because it fits. I didn't have words for the quiet dissonance I carried as a kid because nothing about my life looked unusual from the outside. I was the kind of child adults described with safe adjectives: polite, sensitive, bright, a little shy. I learned early how to make people comfortable, and I was praised for it. So, I mistook that skill for a personality. The first time I put on clothes that weren't meant for me, it wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a decision. It was a moment of curiosity, so ordinary it could have belonged to anyone. And maybe it did. I was alone in the house, maybe 9 or 10, bored in that restless way children get when the day stretches too long. My mother had left clean laundry on the edge of her bed, folded with a tidy precision she used for everything. The fabric looked softer than what I wore. It had color that wasn't muted or practical. I touched it with my fingertips like you touch something you aren't sure you're allowed to touch. There was no plan beyond that. I remember holding a blouse up to my chest and watching the fabric move when I breathed, as if it were alive in a way my own clothes never were. What I felt wasn't excitement the way people sometimes imagine. It was recognition, but not the kind that arrives with certainty. It was more like hearing a melody you didn't know you remembered. My heart beat hard anyway. Not because the act was thrilling, but because I knew, even as a child, that some curiosities come with consequences. That was the first lesson. Whatever this was, it was private. Privacy became my method of survival before I could name what I was surviving. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I didn't steal anything. Didn't keep a secret stash. I told myself it was a one-time thing. The way kids tell themselves any forbidden thing will be the last. But the feeling stayed. Not the blouse itself, not the idea of women's clothes as an object, but the shift inside me when I imagined myself differently. It was as if I discovered a door in my own house that I'd never noticed before. It didn't lead anywhere obvious, and I was afraid to open it, but I couldn't forget it existed. Years passed the way they do when you're young. Quickly in memory, slowly while you're inside them. I became a teenager who tried hard to be normal, which meant I studied normal the way you study a subject you don't naturally understand. I watched how boys sat, how they joked, the kinds of things they were supposed to care about. Copied the rhythm, got good at it. From the outside, I looked like I belonged, and that made people assume I did, which only deepened my fear that if they knew what I felt, they would feel tricked. At the same time, I wasn't miserable all the time. That's important because it's easy to flatten a life into a single theme once you know what the theme is. I had friends. I laughed. I felt proud when I did well at school. I had the usual storms of adolescence, the usual bruises to the ego, but underneath there was a constant low-level tension. The sense that my inner life was wider than the role I'd been assigned, and that I was responsible for keeping it hidden. Crossdressing, when it returned to my life, came back in small, careful experiments rather than dramatic leaps. A thrift store scarf, I told myself, was gender-neutral. A sweater with a softer cut that I justified as fashion. A moment alone at home when I tried on something and then erased all evidence of it before anyone could come back. I didn't photograph myself. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even let myself think the word that might have made it real. I treated it like a pressure valve, something I did so the rest of my life could stay intact. If you've never lived with that kind of compartmentalization, it might sound simple. Just don't do it, or just do it openly. But the middle space is where a lot of people live, and it's a strange place. In the middle space, you aren't lying exactly because you aren't asked direct questions. But you're also never fully honest, because honesty would require vocabulary you don't trust. You learn to manage your own mind the way someone manages a household budget, allocating small amounts of freedom and secrets so the larger structure doesn't collapse. By my early 20s, I had built a life that looked stable. I went to school, then worked, paid rent. I made the kind of small talk that convinces people you're fine. I even dated, though dating introduced its own dilemmas. I could feel tenderness, and I could feel attraction in a way that was gentle and human. But there was always a part of me that remained backstage watching. I was terrified of being loved for the version of me that was easiest to understand. Because what would happen if someone loved me and then discovered the rest? The thought made me cautious, and caution, I learned, can look like distance. I didn't have a dramatic breakdown. I didn't have a single moment of crisis that forced everything into the open. What happened instead was quieter, and that quietness made it harder to respect. I told myself that because I wasn't in immediate danger, because I could function, the problem wasn't real. I didn't understand yet that you can live a functional life and still slowly lose parts of yourself if you keep them locked away long enough. Then came the cold. Sounds almost ridiculous to say it that plainly. A normal seasonal cold. The kind you catch because someone at work sneezed into the air and you didn't wash your hands at the right moment. The kind you expect to last a week. I remember the scratchy throat, the heavy head, the dull ache in my muscles like I'd been carrying something. I stayed home for a couple days, drank tea, tried to sleep. The fever wasn't even high enough to be dramatic. I assumed it would pass, and I'd return to my routine with a small pride of someone who endured a mild inconvenience. But when the obvious symptoms faded, something else stayed behind. First, it was subtle. I looked at my face in the bathroom mirror and thought I seemed different. Not in a way I could define, softer around the eyes, less sharp. I blamed the lighting, the fatigue, the fact that I'd been dehydrated. I went to work and found myself strangely emotional. Not in a way that made me cry at my desk, but in a way that made everything feel closer to the surface. A song in a grocery store triggered a memory so vivid it made my chest ache. Commercial about an aging parent made my throat tighten. I told myself I was just run down. The problem with subtle changes is that your mind searches for explanations that keep your world familiar. Stress, I thought, lack of sleep. I bought vitamins. I drank more water. I started jogging again, then stopped because I felt oddly weak. Then started again, because stopping made me feel like I was surrendering. I went down the list of reasonable fixes the way people do when they want to solve a problem without admitting the problem might require a different kind of solution. Over the next few weeks, the feeling didn't disappear. It expanded. It wasn't just emotions. It was my sense of my own body. When I rested my hand on my cheek, I felt an unfamiliar gentleness in the contours, as if I were touching someone else. My skin seemed different, though, when I asked myself to explain that. I couldn't. I became more aware of textures. Fabric against my wrist, warm air on my neck, the weight of my hair when it was damp. Those are normal sensations, of course, but I'd never noticed them with such intensity. It was as if the cold had turned up the volume on physical experience. And then, without me planning it, the old door in my mind creaked open again. One evening alone in my apartment, I found myself staring at my closet, not with the usual practical calculation of tomorrow's outfit, but with a kind of longing. I hadn't cross-dressed in months. Life had been busy. I'd pushed it aside, as I always did when I felt I needed to be responsible. But that night, I felt pulled toward it, not like an indulgence, but like a question that had been waiting patiently. I want to be careful here because I know how stories like this can be framed, and I'm not interested in that framing. This wasn't about thrill. This wasn't about escaping into a fantasy version of myself. It was about trying to make sense of a shift that was already happening and reaching for the one language my body seemed to know. Changing how I presented myself to see if my inner experience could match my outer one, even briefly. I took out a few items I'd kept tucked away. Simple things I'd bought over the years with a careful anonymity of someone buying contraband that wasn't contraband. Soft sweater, a pair of pants with a different cut than mine. Nothing extreme, nothing meant to shock. I put them on slowly, almost clinically, like I was conducting an experiment. Then I looked at myself. What I saw didn't resolve anything, but it did something more honest. It made the conflict visible. My face still looked like mine, but the expression I wore was unfamiliar. I looked calmer, not happy exactly, calmer like someone who had been holding their breath and finally noticed it. My eyes filled with tears, and that scared me more than anything because I didn't know what those tears meant. Relief, grief, fear, all of it at once. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to think like an adult about what was happening. The cold had ended, but my sense of self felt unsteady, as if the illness had stirred something loose. I considered the possibility that I was imagining everything. I considered the possibility that it was hormonal or neurological or some rare syndrome I'd never heard of. I did what anxious people do at midnight. I searched for explanations, and the explanations multiplied until they became another kind of anxiety. The next day, I called a clinic. The doctor I saw was kind in the polite, professional way. The way someone is kind when they can't afford to be emotionally involved. I described the lingering fatigue, the emotional sensitivity, the sense that my body felt different. I didn't mention the clothes. I didn't mention the mirror. I didn't mention the door in my mind because I still wasn't sure whether it was part of the problem or part of the solution. The doctor ordered basic blood work. When the results came back normal, they told me to rest, reduce stress, and come back if symptoms worsened. Normal can be comforting, but it can also be lonely. If nothing is wrong on paper, then whatever is wrong must be you. I went back to work and smiled at coworkers and answered emails while feeling like I was living in a body that had developed a faint echo. I began to notice how people talked about gender casually. The assumptions baked into jokes. The way man up was used as a synonym for be responsible. I'd heard those phrases all my life, but now they landed differently, like they were aimed at a part of me that was tired of being managed. At the same time, I didn't want to blame society for everything. That would have been too easy. My conflict wasn't just external. It was internal, rooted in my own fear, my own desire to be seen as good, my own belief that causing discomfort was the same as causing harm. I had confused other people's surprise with their pain. And so I treated my own truth like a potential weapon. That I realize now is a heavy and unfair thing to place on yourself. Weeks turned into months. The lingering post-cold changes didn't become dramatic, but they didn't fade either. My face didn't transform overnight. My body didn't become someone else's, but my relationship to myself changed in a way that was unmistakable. I found myself caring less about performing masculinity and more about feeling honest. I started moisturizing my skin because it felt good, not because it made me look a certain way. I let my hair grow a little longer because it made me feel more like myself. I bought clothes that fit my body in a softer way, still within what most people would consider normal but closer to what I wanted. And every time I did, I felt both relief and fear. Relief because something inside me unclenched. Fear because relief felt like proof, and proof felt like a responsibility. If the things I dismissed as just curiosity were actually part of my identity, then I couldn't keep treating them like a hobby. But if I acknowledge them, I risk changing my life. Changing your life sounds romantic until you remember that your life includes other people. And your choices create ripples you can't fully predict. I began to notice a new kind of ethical question forming beneath my private struggle. What do I owe myself? And what do I owe the people who think they know me? I didn't want to deceive anyone. I also didn't want to offer the most intimate parts of myself as public property. Somewhere between secrecy and exposure, there had to be a responsible path. I just didn't know what it was yet. I wish I could tell you I found clarity quickly. I didn't. What I found first was a deeper confusion, the kind that comes when denial stops working. Confusion can feel like failure, but it's often the beginning of honesty. When the old coping mechanisms lose their power, you're forced to learn new ones. And learning always feels unsteady before it feels like growth. By the time I finally admitted to myself that crowd-stressing wasn't going away, that it wasn't a phase or a stress response, I had to confront another fear I hadn't expected. The fear that I might use this self-discovery as an excuse to abandon responsibility. I'd seen stories online and in life where someone found themselves and left behind relationships without care or acted as if self-expression justified harming others. I didn't want to become that person. I wanted to become more honest without becoming cruel. I wanted to expand my life, not explode it. So, I started with something small and almost boring, which is usually where real change begins. Found a therapist. I was careful. I looked for someone who listed experience with identity and gender issues, but who also seemed grounded, not ideological, not eager to put me into a category before understanding me. In the first session, I talked around the truth like someone describing a fire, without naming flames. I said I'd been feeling disconnected. I said I'd been experiencing emotional shifts since being sick. I said I didn't recognize myself sometimes. The therapist listened and then asked gently, "When do you feel most like yourself?" The question landed in me like a weight. Most like myself, not least anxious, not most approved of. Most like myself. I didn't answer right away. My throat tightened the way it does when you're about to say something you've avoided for years. And then quietly, I told the truth in the smallest possible form. I said there was something I did sometimes in private that made me feel calm. I said it involved clothes. I said I was ashamed. The therapist didn't react the way I'd rehearsed people reacting. There was no surprise, no alarm, no moral judgment, just curiosity and care. They asked how long it had been part of my life. They asked what it meant to me. They asked what I feared would happen if someone knew. And as I answered, I realized something that changed the shape of my whole story. The real issue wasn't the clothing. The clothing was a language. The real issue was that I had never learned how to listen to myself without immediately translating what I heard into what other people might tolerate. That was the beginning of the next phase, the one that would force me to make choices with real consequences. Choices that couldn't stay contained in my apartment or my therapy sessions. Because once you start telling the truth to one safe person, it becomes harder to justify lying to everyone else, including